All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unlocking a really fascinating historical mystery hidden in verses 83 to 101 of Surah Al-Kahf. If you've ever been captivated by ancient histories, epic geographic expeditions, or those legendary kings who literally shaped the ancient world, you are absolutely in for a treat. We're going to explore a narrative that beautifully blends history, geography, and some deep moral philosophy, all pulled directly from classical Islamic texts and historical commentary. It's a story that asks some pretty profound questions about power, justice, and the ultimate fate of human achievements. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the two-horned mystery, then follow along on the journey to the west and the journey to the east. After that, we'll dig into Gog, Magog, and the wall, and finally wrap up with the final promise.
Section 1. The Two-Horned Mystery, Decoding the King.
So, this whole mystery actually begins with a test. You see, to prove his prophetic credentials, the Prophet Muhammad was asked about a highly specific, legendary figure. The Meccan unbelievers, urged on by the Jews, wanted to see if he truly had access to extraordinary divine knowledge about someone whose history was known to the people of the book, but definitely not to the local Arabs. The crucial point here was figuring out the actual historical identity of this ruler, Dhul-Qarnayn, which literally translates to the two-horned. Establishing exactly who this was has been a massive ancient puzzle, and to solve it, we really need to look at the exact parameters set by the text itself. Now, to gamify our historical detective work just a bit, the text drops 4 distinct clues. First, the title, The Two-Horned, had to be familiar to the Jews, since they're the ones who prompted the initial question. Second, he had to be a conqueror whose empire spanned vastly from east to west, plus a third major directional expedition. Third, he had to be the builder of a formidable defensive wall across a mountain pass to protect against the tribes of Gog and Magog. And finally, and honestly, this is probably the most important one, the text portrays him not as some ruthless tyrant, but as a deeply God-conscious and remarkably just ruler. So who actually fits this specific profile? Well, for a long time, early scholars kind of leaned toward Alexander the Great, but contemporary historical evidence strongly points in a totally different direction. Alexander really lacks the monotheistic, just characteristics described in the text. Instead, the evidence strongly points to the Persian emperor, Cyrus the Great. Think about our clues for a second. In the Bible, the book of Daniel actually describes the united empire of Media and Persia under Cyrus as a two-horned ram. He conquered territories stretching all the way from Asia Minor in the west to Balkh in the east and up to Caucasia in the north. Plus, the book of Ezra explicitly praises Cyrus as a God-worshipping, just king who liberated the Israelites. He just perfectly aligns with the profile.
Section 2. Journey to the West, the Muddy Spring.
With God granting him supreme power and incredible resources, Cyrus sets out westward on his first major recorded expedition. He pushes on and conquers territories until he literally hits the extreme limit of the landmass. Standing there, to him, the sun looked like it was sinking into a blackish, muddy spring. Historically speaking, this was highly likely the western coast of Asia Minor, where the Aegean Sea splits into these small, murky gulfs. He had basically reached the very edge of the known world.
And it's here, upon encountering a completely helpless people at this western edge, that a crucial moment unfolds. Being in total, absolute control of a newly conquered nation, God gives Dhul-Qarnayn a test of his moral caliber. Now, the source text explains this not necessarily as a booming verbal revelation, but as a deep question posed directly to his conscience. O Dhul-Qarnayn, you have the power to punish or to treat them with kindness. Think about that. It's the ultimate test of character, right? What do you do when absolutely no one can stop you? Well, he passes brilliantly. He declares he will only punish those who do wrong, knowing they'll face an even greater punishment from God later. But to those who are righteous, he will reward them and issue only mild, easy commands. He actively chooses to establish justice over tyranny.
Section 3. Journey to the East, the Unsheltered People. Next, he turns his massive army completely around and marches all the way to the exact opposite end of the civilized world. In his eastern expedition, he reached the limit where the sun rises, the absolute farthest eastern territories of his empire. And here, he encounters a nation that's quite different from the West. The text describes them as a people for whom God had provided zero shelter from the sun. The historical commentary explains that these were likely primitive, perhaps enslaved nations living right at the edge of civilization, who entirely lacked the skills to construct houses or even pitch basic tents. It's an incredible contrast, and it really showcases the sheer vastness and diversity of the lands now under his protection.
Section 4. Gog, Magog, and the Wall. The Northern Threat. Now for his most famous expedition. He travels north to a remote mountain pass in Caucasia, right smack between the Caspian and Black Seas. When he gets there, he encounters people who spoke a language so foreign they could scarcely even understand him. But despite the heavy language barrier, their desperate plea was loud and clear. These locals were absolutely terrified of Gog and Magog, or Yajuj and Majuj. The source material identifies them as wild, highly predatory tribes from northeastern Asia. We're talking infamous groups pouring over civilized lands like destructive tidal waves, spreading massive corruption wherever they went. To the ancient world, these guys were a literal nightmare.
So the desperate locals make him an offer. They tell him they'll pay Dhul-Qarnayn taxes if he would just build a protective barrier between them and these relentless invaders. But watch Dhul-Qarnayn's response here. Demonstrating his core motif as a humble and just leader, he flat out refuses their money. He tells them the power and resources God had already granted him were more than enough. He had no desire to exploit them. All he asked for was their physical labor to help him get the project done. And guys, what happens next is an absolute masterclass in ancient defensive engineering. First, he commands them to haul in massive blocks and sheets of solid iron. They essentially leveled out the empty space between these two steep mountain cliffs. Then, he has them light a massive fire and ply bellows until the entire, immense iron structure is glowing red-hot. Finally, the genius stroke. He has molten copper poured over the entire thing. By fusing that iron and molten copper, he created this colossal, perfectly smooth rampart that the wild tribes of Gog and Magog could neither scale nor pierce. It was just an unparalleled feat of construction. Section 5. The Final Promise, the Ultimate Endgame.
Now, you might think the story just wraps up right here with this grand worldly achievement, right? But it doesn't. The narrative immediately shifts into this awe-inspiring apocalyptic epilogue. Look at what Dhul-Qarnayn says right after finishing this architectural wonder. Instead of puffing up with pride, instead of, carving his name into the stone as some immortal god king, he attributes the whole thing entirely to God's mercy. He says, "This is a mercy from my Lord." And then he admits something really profound. Even his greatest, most indestructible work is temporary. He declares that when the appointed time of God's promise arrives, God will level this mighty rampart to the ground. His trust isn't in the iron and copper at all. It's completely in the divine timeline.
The source text then zooms out to expand on what that appointed time actually means. He's reminding us of the Day of Judgment. The narrative shifts to describe that on the last day, this massive, unbreachable wall will literally be leveled to dust. But it won't just be Gog and Magog pouring forth. The text says humanity itself will surge together like crashing waves. The trumpet will be blown, everyone will be gathered, and hell will be presented clearly to those who stubbornly refuse to hear the truth, whose eyes were blinded by a veil against God's admonition. The physical wall finally falls, and the eternal reality begins.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. We've just walked through an incredible journey of power, justice, and engineering. But Dhul-Qarnayn himself teaches us the ultimate lesson in perspective. If the most impenetrable wall, built by one of history's greatest kings out of fused iron and copper, is ultimately destined to crumble to dust, what walls are we building today? Are we putting all our faith in our own worldly fortresses, and are those fortresses blinding us to the ultimate promise? It's a wildly fascinating history for sure, but it serves as an even more powerful reality check. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey today.